The anthropology of conformism in Japan. All varying manners of countries and cultures have participated in some form of conformism throughout time, and each culture has its own unique story surrounding the reasons for its conformism. Though some countries lean towards individualism, conformism still exists in those places. Just the same, countries that lean towards conformism also have some individualism. The social spectrum that is conformism exists across all cultures, regardless of their leanings. One such country that is stereotyped by outsiders and insiders alike as being conformist is Japan, or Nippon, the land of the rising sun. Japanese culture's propensity for extreme conformism truly began in the 17th century and peaked during World War II. The Japanese ruling class, or elites, manipulated Japanese people to conform, using the geographical isolation of their country, by implementing a strictly controlled public schooling system, and by skewing concepts within the Japanese language to be conformist. Western cultures are generally labeled as having more individualistic, non-conformist cultures, and that may be due in part because of a lack of homogeneity within Western populations. Cultures that are stereotyped as being more conformist, such as East Asian cultures, tend to have a much higher degree of homogeneity among their people. The homogeneity in Japan is as clear as day, and it is a direct result of the Sakoku, or closed country era, in Japanese history. This era lasted from 1633 to 1853, and it was enacted by the Tokugawa shogunate. Sakoku was an isolationist policy that prevented Japanese people from leaving the country and prevented foreigners from entering. Trade was still allowed, but in an extremely limited and highly regulated fashion. This isolationist policy was an attempt to preserve the Tokugawa shogunate's political power and wealth during a time of change, and forcefully secure the loyalty of the Japanese people via isolation. The early sprouts of globalization sprang forth during the seafaring era, and with it came new religions, new ideas, and new technologies. The age of sail was in full swing around the time of Sakoku, and foreigners such as traders and missionaries were flooding into Japan at unprecedented rates. One of the biggest threats to the Tokugawa shogunate during this time period was Christianity, as Christians put God above all else, including the emperor and ruling class of Japan. This meant that a commoner's loyalty would be to God instead of to his daimyo, meaning lord, or the emperor. As Christianity began to take hold in Japan, Sakoku was enacted, Christianity was banned, and Christians that refused to renounce their faith were sadly tortured and killed. The shogunate was also weary that rival political groups within Japan would rebel and align themselves with Europeans, especially if they shared a common religion. As a result of Sakoku and other extreme policies of the Tokugawa shogunate, a thin veil of peace fell on Japan for 2.5 centuries, enforced by strict laws and geographical isolation. The Tokugawa shogunate ensured Japan's cultural and religious isolation for 250 years, which led to enhanced unity, homogeneity, and a strong loyalty towards the emperor among Japanese people. Isolation has its drawbacks, however peaceful things may have been, and it led to a widely ignorant and naive Japanese populace. Ironically, there is a Japanese saying befitting of the isolationist period: "The frog in the well does not know the ocean." As the Tokugawa shogunate came to an end, the ruling elite took advantage of the naive, isolated population to enact a multitude of new laws and policies which would ultimately be remembered as the Meiji Restoration. Many of these laws and policies mirrored those of Western nations, but they were still decidedly Japanese in style, enforcing national unity, ethnocentrism, self-sacrifice, perseverance, and absolute loyalty among Japanese people. One of the biggest and most influential of these policies was a new Western-style public schooling system. Author and historian Saburo Ienaga, when talking about the Pacific War era, said, "Why were the Japanese people intolerant of Chinese and Koreans? I think the answer lies in the state's manipulation of information and values to produce mass conformity and unquestioning obedience." Not only did the new Meiji government pass laws that strictly controlled journalism, the right to assembly, and free speech, but they also overhauled the governmental system and public school system to resemble those in the West. All educational materials such as books and lesson plans had to be government sanctioned and went through a rigorous certification system to get approval. Around 90% of Japanese school-aged children were enrolled in the new public schools after 1900, and the government used state-approved education to indoctrinate a new generation into mass conformity. Above all else, the education offered in the public school system at the turn of the 20th century focused on emperor worship, self-sacrifice, and militarism. The emperor carried both absolute and sacred authority due to his direct descendants from Amaterasu, the Japanese sun goddess. When school began each spring, emperor-centric, patriotic rituals marked the start of the year, where children had to revere the imperial photo. Patriotism and war were to be taught in every possible subject, even mathematics, and unconditional obedience to the government's authority was stressed daily. Beginning in 1925, military officers were assigned to most schools, except girls' schools, and physical military training became a part of the everyday curriculum. While the law and police force kept adults conforming to the status quo, the public school system ensured as many children as possible would grow up unquestioning and obedient. Besides revamping the government, legislation, and public school systems, the Meiji government also drafted a new constitution, becoming the first country in Asia to do so. In this constitution, the absolute divinity and power of the current emperor is laid out clearly, but so are the duties of Japanese citizens. The constitution uses words such as giri, wa, haji, on, and ninjo to detail the duties and obligations of Japanese people. It is difficult to translate these words directly into English, as they are all complex social concepts within Japanese culture that do not necessarily exist in Western cultures. Giri can be roughly translated into burden of obligation. Wa is usually translated as harmony. Haji can mean shame or disgrace. On is a type of relationship hierarchy, and ninjo could be translated as humanness. According to the idea of linguistic relativity, Japanese people may have been easier to manipulate into conformity because of their language. Linguistic relativity, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, proposes that the language someone speaks influences the way they think about reality as well as their perception of the world. Although this is still a hypothesis that requires more rigorous testing, it is generally accepted among anthropologists as being a real phenomenon. When looking at the first Japanese constitution and their early public schooling system, concepts such as wa, on, giri, ninjo, and haji are both directly mentioned and implied. Sociologist Kiyohide Seki describes one of these concepts, on, in detail, stating, "The Japanese have three major ons, namely on from emperor, on from parents, and on from teacher. The Japanese have said, on from emperor is immeasurable, or on from parents is higher than the mountains and deeper than the seas." The influence and weight of these words and concepts for Japanese people cannot be underestimated, especially in the context of being used by authority figures of higher status. The Japanese ruling elites have been manipulating Japanese people for hundreds of years, and slowly over time they have created a conformist-leaning society in Japan. They did this first by using the geographical isolation of their country to force the borders closed, increasing homogeneity as well as peace within the country. The ruling class decided 250 years later to revamp the government, and one goal they had was to both educate and indoctrinate children using a strictly controlled public schooling system. Finally, they pushed cultural concepts such as on, giri, and wa, which on their own are not necessarily conformist, but skewed them in a conformist way to control Japanese people from a position of power. Although the peak of Japanese society's conformity was certainly during World War II, the rippling effects of the old ruling class's grip on the people is still felt to this day. Alright everyone, I hope you liked the video. I know it's a little bit different from my other videos, but anthropology is something I am super duper interested in, and conformism is a subject that I picked for this video essay. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, learned something new. Thanks so much for tuning in. Catch you on the flip side.